In this video, I'm going to show you how to reduce image noise in Photoshop. So the image that we're going to use is this gnome image here. And if I zoom in, you can see that it was taken with ISO 6400, so high, but not super high, but it was with a Canon T6, so an older camera, and you can see how much noise was produced in this image. So to fix this, the first thing we're going to do is just duplicate our image, so Control or Command J to make the copy. Then we're going to right click and go up to Convert to Smart Object. Okay, now go up to Filter and down to Camera Raw Filter. Now there is another way to do this under Noise. You can do Reduce Noise. I just prefer Camera Raw Filter, so I'll show you this way. Okay, so once we go in here, you're gonna have all these like drop down things like this. You're gonna find the one that says Detail, and we're not gonna do sharpening. Actually, let me just zoom in to like 200% here and go to this hand so I can move it kind of over to that spot that I was showing you before. So if we go to sharpening, we obviously don't want to do that, because if you do that, that brings back more noise and kind of these weird little artifacts in there. So avoid that. You're going to go down to noise reduction. And if we crank this all the way, you're going to see that it really gets rid of all the noise, but it'll really soften up your image. So really just decide kind of how far you want to go with that. Feel free to go as high as you want. I'm going to go to about just 80 or so. If we go to detail, I like to keep it around 50, just keep it there, because if you go too much to this side to bring the detail back, we get, kind of noise and artifacts back in it. And if you go too low, then it softens it up way too much. So I'm just going to keep it around 50. And then contrast, kind of the same thing. It doesn't impact it as much as detail, but so I like to just turn it up just a little bit to bring some contrast back into it. As far as color noise goes, this one is, you can just crank this one way up, because if you see in this, you can see that a lot of times noise has kind of these different color patterns. So if you can see it on your screen, mine has kind of this green and kind of red, purpley kind of noise in the background here. So if I crank this up, it actually gets rid of the variation in color in the noise to make it look a little bit nicer. So I'm just going to crank that way up. You'll just watch, I'll slide it back and forth so maybe you can see it a little bit better. Okay, so I'm going to crank that up. And then for the smoothness, I'm just going to bump it up just a bit. And then we're pretty much done. I'm going to click OK. And there it is. That's the newly reduced noise image. I'm going to zoom out just one so we can see it a little bit better. So now if I click this eyeball, you can see that's what it was before. So look, especially in the darker kind of areas here, down here, you can see that's what it was before. And then now that's noise reduced. All right, so at this point, your image should already be looking pretty good, but I'm going to show you a few other things that you can do to enhance what we've already done with Camera Raw Filter, and then I'm going to show you two other filters that you can add as well, if you want. Okay, so the first thing to take note of over here is that the reason that we made this a smart object with smart filters is that now whenever we want to adjust these, so if there's something we still want to adjust, all we have to do is double click on the filter, so Camera Raw Filter. It'll bring us into that menu. We can make further adjustments if we need. So let's just say I want to boost that up a little bit and then click OK, and it will apply that adjustment to the filter. The second thing is opacity up here. So we've applied this, noise reduction to this one right here. But if I take opacity of that layer and I drop it all the way down to 0, you'll see that now we are looking at basically this background or original image again with all that noise. So let's say you added too much. Like once you look at it, you're like, that's too much noise reduction. You can also just slide the opacity back a little bit to kind of blend it between this layer and this layer. I'm going to keep mine up at 100 right now, but you can adjust that if you want. The third thing, so the last quick thing I'm going to show you, has to do with the mask right here. So I'm going to click on this, and let's just say that there's most of this you want to keep as like full opacity as 100% of this noise reduction. But there's certain parts that you want to be sharper, like you want to reveal more of the sharpness from the original image. Then all you have to do is go to your brush tool, make sure that black is in the foreground here, and then I would just drop your opacity down to, let's just say 60 something percent, and your flow down to like 25-30%. Make sure your brush size is kind of appropriate for what you're going to paint. So I'm going to paint in the eye right here and just drop your hardness down. Okay, so the reason why we're doing this is because whatever we paint with black onto this mask is going to reveal essentially the details from the original image. So I'm going to go over this eye to reveal the details. Actually, let me just zoom in even more. So I'm going to undo that. And you're going to look right here in the eye. As I paint, you're going to see a little bit of the detail plus the noise. Remember, the noise is going to come back too. Not all the way, just kind of 60% each time I kind of paint over here. So the more you paint, the sharper that part is going to get. The more noise and the more detail is going to come back. So I'm going to do that eye. I just painted over it twice. I'm going to go for this eye. I'm going to do the same thing. So I painted over it. I'm going to let go and then paint again. And that brings back that. So now when we look at it, we've applied the noise reduction to all of this, like to everything else, but we've kind of punched a hole through here and here to bring back the detail from the background here. And you can see the two little black zones on the mask that I painted through. At this point, I'm just going to show you a few other filters that you can add to your image if you want to further enhance this kind of noise reduction process. Whether that means adding more noise reduction to things or, sharpening up some things that have become kind of softer in your image because of the noise reduction. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is duplicate my layer 1. I'm actually going to call this one, camera raw. And then I'm going to duplicate that, Control or Command J to make a copy. And this one I'm going to call, let's say, new filters. You don't need to make a copy. You can just keep working off of your same one. I'm making a copy so I can show you kind of all three versions with the new filters, what it looked like just with camera raw, and then what our original image was at the very end. Okay, so I'm going to hide camera raw and I'm just going to work on this new filters one up here. So the first thing we're going to add is up here under filter and then down to blur and down to surface blur. Now in here you're going to see that there's really only two sliders, radius and threshold. If I crank radius up, you're going to see your image over here. It's going to turn kind of cartoony or like posterized a little bit, like there it goes right there, posterized. And then threshold is the thing that makes it kind of foggy, blurry, and like smooth for the surface. But you'll notice that the eyes that we painted on aren't affected by this because whatever's on our mask here in white, that's what's going to be affected by whatever we do on these filters. Anything that's in black, those eyes, you're going to keep that detail from the original image. So I'm going to drop my radius to about 6, so I'm not going to keep that very high. And threshold, I'm only going to go to about 12. So play around with those until you get something that looks a little bit smooth. Don't go crazy, keep them pretty low and then click OK. So if I click the eyeball here now, we can see that that was without surface blur. You can see some of that detail comes back in. And then this is with surface blur and it just kind of smooths it out a little bit. But because of that, now we have to kind of sharpen it back up a little bit. So we're going to go back up to filter, down to sharpen, and then over to smart sharpen. So in here, you're going to have to play around with a few things. So amount, radius, and reduce noise. Well, reduce noise, not so much. I would suggest though going to remove and making sure that it's on Gaussian blur, not these other two to start. And then just play around with your amount and radius here. So if I crank amount up, you can see that that is what brings back some of the sharpness in your image. And then radius is the thing that creates kind of depth, like that contrast between light and dark, almost like a beveled look. So I'm just going to, add a little bit of amount, there. So a little bit of sharpness, and I'm going to bring radius back. If I go too far, then it kind of softens it out. The reason why we're doing this is to bring some of the detail back without, going too crazy, because then we get some of that noise and some like weird artifact stuff that I'll show you here in a second. Okay, so just kind of play around with those two things until you get kind of a decent looking image, and then just click OK. And I'll show you again, this was without Smart Sharpen, so that's what we had after Surface Blur. When we click Smart Sharpen, we're going to get that kind of detail stuff back in here and some of that sharpness. Now, the only thing to be aware of here is the reason why I don't use this very much is you can see that when you add too many things, then you're going to start having to deal with other things. So there's kind of these like warbly edges here, like some of these look all funky right here. And now if I bring back the camera raw one and then click this eyeball with the new filters, you can see that, yeah, it's a little bit softer in some of these areas, but the edges just look a little bit more natural here. So if I click back on the new filters one, that's what we kind of get. It's kind of these weird, like it is sharper edges, and it doesn't look quite as good. But just like I told you before, we can do a couple things with that. We can now go back into Smart Sharpen by double clicking it, and you can play around here with amounts. If you want to bring it back and not have it be so crazy, you can do that, and then click OK. And then you can also drop the opacity. So if I get rid of this camera raw one for a second, if you drop the opacity on this effect, it'll kind of blend back in with the original one from down here, our background image. Again, if you go too low, then you're going to get all that noise back in. If you go all the way up, then you have the full like filter stuff on it. And if you kind of peel it back a little bit, you'll get a little bit of a combination and blend those two together. And that's it. That's a couple different ways that you can reduce noise in Photoshop. If you got something out of this video, make sure to drop a like. And if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, and I'll catch you next time.